300 feet beneath the grey swell of the North Atlantic, somewhere off the coast of Scotland, a Royal Navy frigate is listening. It is a foul night in the autumn of 1974. The wind is up, the sea is heaving, and aboard HMS Lowestoft, the only sound that matters is the faint, rhythmic thrum bleeding through a sonar operator's headphones. He has been tracking it for 9 hours. It does not belong to any British vessel. It does not belong to any Allied vessel. It is a Soviet submarine, almost certainly a nuclear-powered hunter-killer. And it is loitering precisely where it should not be, astride the deep water channels through which, in the event of war, the Royal Navy's own ballistic missile submarines would have to creep towards their firing positions. The young rating glances at his officer. Neither man speaks. They both understand what this silent duel means. If the balloon ever went up, if the Cold War turned hot, the survival of the United Kingdom rested on whether men like these could find the other side first. Whether they could trail a Soviet boat for days without being detected, mark its position, and, if the order came, kill it before it killed them. There were no medals for this work, no headlines. The public slept soundly precisely because nobody told them how thin the margin really was. This was a war that never officially happened. There were no declarations, no front pages, no cenotaph. And yet for the better part of 40 years, from the late 1940s until the Berlin Wall came down, the Royal Navy fought a relentless, exhausting, deadly serious campaign in the freezing waters between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. A stretch of ocean that planners gave a dry, unglamorous name that would come to define the entire struggle. The GIUK Gap. Through this narrow funnel, every Soviet submarine breaking out of its northern bases at Murmansk and Polyarny had to pass to reach the open Atlantic. And it was here that Britain decided, quietly and at enormous cost, that it would make its stand. Because Whitehall understood something the public did not. In any future war with the Soviet Union, the decisive battle would not be fought on the plains of Germany. It would be fought, as it had been twice before, in the cold, black water of the Atlantic, over the convoys, the reinforcement routes, the lifelines without which Britain and her allies could not survive a fortnight. The men who fought this campaign would spend whole careers chasing shadows. They would lose boats. They would lose friends. They would sit in cramped operations rooms at Northwood, north of London, watching pencil tracks crawl across charts, knowing that a single mistake might mean a Soviet missile boat slipping undetected into the Atlantic with the power to incinerate British cities. The stakes could not have been higher. And the strangest part of all? Most of those who served had no idea, even then, just how close they sometimes came. How did a Royal Navy, emerging battered and bankrupt from the Second World War, come to fight, and largely win, the longest naval campaign in its modern history? How did Britain, an empire in retreat, persuade itself it could still hold the line against the largest submarine fleet the world had ever seen? And what did that decision cost a nation already struggling to pay its bills? To understand the hunt, we first have to understand the desperate, diminished Britain that chose to begin it. In 1945, Britain had won the war and lost almost everything else. The country that emerged from 6 years of total conflict was victorious, exhausted, and effectively broke. The national debt had ballooned to a level not seen for generations. Whole cities lay in rubble. Rationing, far from ending with the peace, would grind on for nearly another decade. Bread itself was rationed in 1946, something even the darkest days of the Blitz had not required. This was the Britain of Clement Attlee's Labour government, a nation building the National Health Service and the welfare state with one hand whilst clinging with the other to the trappings of a global empire it could no longer afford. And yet, the men in Whitehall who studied the wider world saw, with mounting alarm, that the peace they had bled for was already curdling. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, never warm, always transactional, was collapsing. In Eastern Europe, Stalin's armies had not gone home. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Baltic states. One by one they vanished behind what Churchill, now out of office and speaking in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, famously christened an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. The Foreign Office, under the formidable Ernest Bevin, a former trade union boss with a bricklayer's bluntness and a strategist's mind, concluded that the Soviet Union was not a partner, but a threat. Bevin would become one of the principal architects of the Western alliance that became NATO, signed in 1949. For the Royal Navy, the implications were stark and deeply uncomfortable. The senior service had emerged from the war as a shadow of its former self in relative terms, still large but ruinously expensive, and now competing for shrinking funds with the new welfare state and an emerging nuclear deterrent. Worse, the strategic problem had changed shape entirely. In the war just ended, the great maritime enemy had been Hitler's U-boats, and the Battle of the Atlantic had been won at agonizing cost. Over 30,000 merchant seamen and many thousands of Royal Navy sailors lost to keep the convoys running. The Admiralty knew, better than anyone alive, what a submarine campaign could do to an island nation. Now, British intelligence began to assemble a disturbing picture. The Soviet Union, drawing on captured German U-boat technology and the brilliant designs of the late war Type 21, was building submarines. And not by the dozen, but by the hundred. The Joint Intelligence Committee in London warned that Moscow was constructing the largest underwater fleet in history. To strategists who had lived through 1940 and 1942, the conclusion wrote itself. If war came again, the Soviets would attempt precisely what the Germans had attempted, to sever the sea lanes, to isolate Britain, to starve her into submission, and to cut the Atlantic bridge along which American men and material would have to flow. But there was a new and terrible dimension. The submarine was no longer merely a commerce raider. With the coming of the nuclear age, it was becoming something far more dangerous. A platform that might one day carry missiles capable of striking London itself. The hunt for Soviet submarines was therefore never simply about protecting convoys. It was about national survival in the most literal sense. Britain, diminished and indebted, faced a choice. She could quietly cede the oceans to the rising superpowers and retreat into post-imperial modesty. Or she could decide that even now, the defense of the North Atlantic was a task she could not afford to leave to others. The men of the Admiralty chose the harder road. And to walk it, they would need to rebuild not just a fleet, but an entire science of hunting. The Royal Navy that set out to hunt Soviet submarines could not simply dust off its wartime playbook. The enemy had changed, and so the hunters would have to change with it. In the Second World War, U-boats had been, in essence, surface ships that could dive, slow underwater, forced to surface frequently to recharge their batteries and gulp air, vulnerable to aircraft and radar the moment they broke the waves. Their Soviet successors were a different breed, faster, quieter, able to remain submerged for far longer, and soon, most ominously of all, driven not by diesel and battery, but by nuclear reactors that needed neither air nor refueling for months on end. To meet this threat, Whitehall and the Admiralty marshalled three weapons that would define the campaign. The first was geography. A glance at any chart of the North Atlantic reveals an inconvenient truth for Moscow. The Soviet Northern Fleet, bottled up in the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk, had only one practical route into the open ocean. It had to pass through the gaps between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, the GIUK Gap. Choke it, and you choke the entire Soviet submarine offensive. The British, with their long memory of maritime strategy, grasped instantly that this was where the battle must be fought. The second weapon was science. At the Admiralty Research Laboratory and a constellation of secret establishments, British scientists, many of them veterans of the wartime anti-submarine effort, laboured to perfect the art of detecting a submerged enemy. Sonar, which the Royal Navy had pioneered between the wars under the name ASDIC, was refined and refined again. But the great leap was passive listening. Hydrophones so sensitive they could detect the faint signature of a distant propeller, and eventually vast underwater listening arrays laid across the seabed of the gap itself, feeding their secrets to analysts ashore. The hunt was becoming a contest of physics and patience as much as of seamanship. The third weapon was alliance. Britain could not hold the Atlantic alone, and she knew it. Through NATO, and through the deep and sometimes prickly intelligence partnership with the United States, the legacy of wartime code-breaking at Bletchley Park, now formalised in the UK-USA Signals Agreement, the Royal Navy slotted itself into a wider Western effort. But within that alliance, Britain claimed a particular role. The waters around the United Kingdom, the Eastern Atlantic, the approaches to her own shores, these the Royal Navy would make its own. The headquarters at Northwood would become the nerve centre of Allied anti-submarine warfare in the Eastern Atlantic, a British officer holding a senior NATO command over a sea area of vital importance. And behind it all stood the figures who set the course. Successive First Sea Lords fought brutal Whitehall battles for the funds to build frigates and submarines, whilst the Treasury and rival services eyed every pound. The Chiefs of Staff weighed the maritime threat against the cost of the V-bomber force and later the Polaris missile. There were skeptics aplenty who argued that in an age of hydrogen bombs, a war at sea was a quaint irrelevance, that the next war would be over in an afternoon of nuclear fire. The Admiralty's answer was steady and insistent. If deterrence held, the war would be fought by other means, by submarines stalking submarines in the dark. And if deterrence failed, Britain's own deterrent would have to put to sea, which meant, above all else, that the Royal Navy had to know where the Soviet boats were. By the early 1960s, the contest was fully joined. The Soviets were building nuclear submarines of their own. The quiet war beneath the waves was about to enter its most dangerous decade. The moment everything changed can be dated almost precisely. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, both superpowers crossed a threshold that would transform the hunt from a difficult problem into an existential one. The submarine went nuclear, and then it learnt to carry the bomb. For the Royal Navy, the implications arrived in two hammer blows. The first was the American USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, which in 1958 famously passed beneath the North Pole. Here was a vessel that could circle the globe submerged, that need never surface, that the old wartime tactics simply could not catch. The Admiralty understood at once that Britain would have to follow or be left behind. With characteristic pragmatism and a good deal of American help, secured through the personal diplomacy of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, the Royal Navy commissioned its own first nuclear submarine, HMS Dreadnought, launched on Trafalgar Day 1960. A British boat with an American reactor born of the special relationship at its most intimate. The second blow was graver still. The Soviets, like the Americans, had begun mounting ballistic missiles inside submarines. A boat that could hide in the ocean's depths and launch a nuclear warhead at London or Washington was the ultimate weapon. Invulnerable, undetectable, capable of ending a nation in minutes. And it changed the entire purpose of the hunt. It was no longer enough to protect convoys. The Royal Navy now had to be able to find and, if necessary, destroy Soviet missile submarines before they could fire. The margin for error had collapsed to nothing. Then came October 1962, and the world looked over the edge. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered, rightly, as a confrontation over missiles in the Caribbean. But beneath the surface, quite literally, it was also a submarine crisis. As American warships enforced their blockade, Soviet submarines were detected lurking nearby. And in at least one terrifying instance, a Soviet boat, harried by depth charges and cut off from Moscow, came within one officer's veto of launching a nuclear torpedo. Britain was not at the centre of the Cuban drama, but Whitehall watched in cold horror. And the lesson struck home in the Admiralty with particular force. Submarines were now the cutting edge of nuclear confrontation. To track them was to hold one's finger on the pulse of Armageddon itself. For Britain, the crisis crystallized a decision already taking shape. In December 1962, Macmillan met President Kennedy at Nassau in the Bahamas and secured the Polaris missile system for Britain's own use. The British nuclear deterrent would henceforth go to sea, carried in Royal Navy submarines that would patrol, hidden and silent, somewhere in the North Atlantic. It was a momentous shift. The ultimate guarantee of British survival would now depend on a handful of submarines remaining undetected beneath the waves. And that cut both ways with brutal clarity. If British boats could hide from the Soviets, then Soviet boats could hide from the British. The hunt was no longer a professional exercise in protecting shipping. It had become the central nervous system of national defense. Northwood's analysts now understood that every Soviet submarine slipping through the GIUK Gap might be the one carrying the missiles meant for British cities, or might be the hunter sent to find and kill Britain's own deterrent before it could retaliate. The whole grim architecture of mutual deterrence rested, in the end, on who could hear whom first in the dark. And as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the Soviet Northern Fleet began to surge. More boats, quieter boats, pushing further out into the Atlantic than ever before. The hunters of the Royal Navy were about to face their hardest test. The cat and mouse game beneath the waves was reaching its climax, and the men who played it were sworn to absolute silence. To understand what this war actually felt like, you have to go down into the boat. Imagine a Royal Navy hunter-killer submarine, a nuclear fleet boat of the Valiant or Swiftsure class, patrolling the cold, dark approaches to the GIUK Gap in the depths of the 1970s. There is no day, no night, only the hum of machinery and the green glow of instruments. The crew breathes recycled air. They have not seen the sun in weeks, and somewhere out in that immense blackness is their quarry, a Soviet submarine doing precisely the same thing to them. This was the heart of the campaign, what the trade called trailing. When British intelligence, listening through the seabed arrays and the patient analysts at Northwood, detected a Soviet boat breaking out into the Atlantic, a Royal Navy submarine would be vectored to intercept. The objective was as audacious as it was dangerous: to fall in silently behind the Soviet vessel, to slot into the blind spot in its wake where its own sensors could not hear, and to follow it for hours, for days, sometimes for weeks, recording every sound it made, mapping its patrol routine, learning the acoustic signature that would, in war, mark it for death. It demanded almost superhuman discipline. The hunters moved at a creep, every man aboard schooled to silence, dropped spanners, slammed hatches, even loud conversation could betray the boat. Cooks padded about in soft shoes. The sonar team, ears pressed to the ocean, passed a symphony of sounds. The groan of the deep, the click of shrimp, the distant churn of a merchantman, for the one signature that mattered. To trail a Soviet submarine without being detected was, in the words of those who did it, like following a car down a motorway at night with your own headlights off, reading the road only by the sound of the other vehicle's engine. It was extraordinarily perilous. The two submarines maneuvered in the same volume of water, blind to one another except by sound. The great fear was a crazy Ivan, the Soviet captain's habit of suddenly turning hard, doubling back to sweep the water behind him for exactly the kind of shadow the Royal Navy was attempting to be. In those heart-stopping moments, a British commander had seconds to decide: hold position and risk collision, or break away and lose the contact. Collisions did happen. Boats came home with crumpled bows and dented fins, the crews sworn to secrecy, the incidents buried in classified files for decades. Above the surface, the campaign was waged by other means: Royal Navy frigates, the workhorse anti-submarine vessels, the Leander, and later the Type 22 classes, quartered the gap, towing sonar arrays, listening, prosecuting contacts, and overhead droned the unsung heroes of the hunt, the RAF's Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft, flying from bases in Scotland and Cornwall, sowing patterns of sonobuoys across the ocean, and dropping, when they found their prey, the homing torpedoes that in war would have ended a Soviet patrol in a single thunderclap. The exercises were relentless and the contacts real. Soviet submarines probed ever further, testing British reactions, mapping the very arrays that hunted them. British boats penetrated, on occasion, into the Soviets' own backyard, slipping into the Barents Sea itself, beneath the noses of the Northern Fleet, to gather intelligence of incalculable value. These were operations of breathtaking nerve, known to only a handful in Whitehall, their details guarded as among the most closely held secrets in the British state. And every patrol, every trail, every silent duel carried the same unspoken stakes. This was rehearsal for a war that everyone prayed would never come, but for which, every single day, the Royal Navy had to be utterly, lethally ready. No war is fought without a price, and this silent one was no exception, even though, mercifully, it never erupted into the open conflict for which both sides prepared. The costs were of a different and subtler kind, and Britain paid them in coin that rarely made the newspapers. The most immediate cost was human, and it was paid in the worst way the submarine service knows. Operating boats at the edge of technology in the most hostile environment on Earth exacts a toll regardless of whether a shot is ever fired. Submariners lived with risks the public never saw: fire, flooding, the crushing pressure of the deep, the simple peril of two blind vessels sharing the same black water. The collisions that occurred during trailing operations could have ended in catastrophe at any moment, and the families of those who served lived with an anxiety they could never fully explain, because their loved ones could never tell them where they had been or what they had done. Men returned from patrol unable to speak of months at sea. The secrecy itself was a burden, borne in silence for entire careers, and in many cases carried to the grave. Then there was the financial cost, and it was staggering. Nuclear submarines, sophisticated frigates, maritime patrol aircraft, seabed listening arrays, the vast shore establishments to support them. All of it devoured money on a scale that a post-imperial Britain could barely sustain. Throughout the period, the Royal Navy fought a second, parallel campaign in the corridors of Whitehall, defending its budgets against treasury knives and rival services. The 1966 cancellation of the Navy's planned new aircraft carriers under Harold Wilson's government was a bitter blow that reshaped the entire fleet, forcing the Navy to recast itself ever more explicitly as an anti-submarine force tethered to NATO's Atlantic mission. Defence reviews came and went, each one a knife fight over priorities, each one shadowed by the question of whether Britain could truly afford to be a serious naval power at all. There was a strategic cost too, the cost of dependence. Britain had bought her place in the front rank of the underwater Cold War partly with American technology and American intelligence. The reactor in Dreadnought, the Polaris missile secured at Nassau, the shared product of the Great Signals Intelligence Partnership. All of it bound Britain ever more tightly to Washington. To some in the Cabinet and the Foreign Office, this was the price of remaining relevant. To others, it was a quiet surrender of the independence for which the country had stood alone in 1940. The debate over whether Britain's deterrent was truly her own, or merely an American weapon on loan, would simmer for decades and has never entirely cooled. And there were the failures, the things Britain learnt the hard way. Soviet submarines did at times slip through. The Walker spy ring in the United States, betraying Western naval secrets to Moscow for years, taught the alliance the bitter lesson that the cleverest technology counts for nothing if a traitor hands the enemy the key. British analysts were forced to confront, again and again, the awful possibility that the acoustic advantage on which everything rested might be compromised, that the Soviets might be learning to run quieter, that the margin was narrowing. Yet from every setback, Britain learnt. The campaign forged a generation of submariners, scientists, and intelligence officers of formidable skill. It refined a national expertise in anti-submarine warfare that remains, to this day, among the finest in the world. The cost was real, in money, in secrecy, in lives lived under unbearable pressure, in a hard dependence on a more powerful ally. But the Royal Navy had bought something with it, the knowledge that, if the worst ever came, Britain would not be caught unready in the Atlantic a third time. The hunt did not end with a battle or a treaty. It ended, as the Cold War itself ended, with an exhausted superpower folding its hand. But the consequences of those 40 years in the North Atlantic reached far beyond the water, and they shaped the Britain that emerged blinking into the post-Cold War world. By the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher's government, and in lockstep with Ronald Reagan's America, the campaign reached a new pitch of intensity. Western naval strategy turned aggressive. Rather than waiting to defend the GIUK Gap, NATO planned to take the fight north, to threaten the Soviet bastions in the Barents Sea directly. The Royal Navy's hunter-killers grew quieter and deadlier, and the pressure on the Soviet Northern Fleet became relentless. There is a strong case to be made that this naval pressure, the constant, grinding demonstration that the Soviets could not hide their boats, could not break out unobserved, could not win the underwater war, contributed to the strategic exhaustion that helped bring Moscow to the negotiating table. The hunters had helped, in their silent way, to win the larger contest. The 1982 Falklands War, though fought far from the Atlantic Gap, vindicated the submarine service in dramatic fashion. The nuclear hunter-killer HMS Conqueror, a boat built and crewed for the coal business of trailing Soviet submarines, slipped into the South Atlantic and sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano, the only sinking of a surface warship by a nuclear submarine in history. The skills honed over decades in the Grey North had proved devastatingly real, and the strategic logic held. It was the threat of British submarines, as much as any surface action, that drove the Argentine fleet back into port for the remainder of the conflict. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved 2 years later, the great underwater contest wound down almost overnight. The vast Soviet fleet that had haunted the imaginations of Northwood's planners rusted at its moorings in the Kola fjords, starved of funds, its proud boats reduced to a hazard of leaking reactors. The threat that had justified 4 decades of British effort simply evaporated. For a brief, heady moment, it seemed the hunt might never be needed again, but the institutions and the expertise endured. The Royal Navy's continuous at-sea deterrent, the unbroken chain of patrols by Britain's ballistic missile submarines, begun in 1969 and never once interrupted since, continued through the end of the Cold War and continues to this day, a direct inheritance of the strategic logic forged in those years. The Navy that emerged was smaller, leaner, and far more specialized than the great fleet of 1945. But it carried into the new century a hard-won mastery of the silent world beneath the waves. The special relationship, too, bore the imprint of the campaign. The intelligence sharing, the technology transfer, the joint mastery of the deep that had bound Britain and America together in the Atlantic became one of the most durable strands of the entire alliance, less visible than summits and speeches, but arguably more enduring. Whatever the politicians said in public, beneath the waves, the two navies had learnt to work as one. And for Britain herself, the campaign answered a question that had hung over the country since 1945. A diminished, post-imperial island nation, it turned out, could still matter, could still hold a line of genuine strategic importance, could still bring to the alliance a contribution no one else could quite match. Not through the old imperial grandeur, but through skill, science, and the quiet courage of men who fought a war no one was ever supposed to know about. So what, in the end, are we to make of this 40-year war beneath the waves? A campaign with no victory parade, no famous battle, no monument that most Britons would recognize. Its legacy is, in many ways, the most British thing about it. Profound, decisive, and almost entirely invisible. Consider what was actually achieved. For 4 decades, the Royal Navy ensured that the Soviet Union could never be confident of dominating the North Atlantic, could never count on severing the lifelines between Europe and America, could never be certain its missile submarines would reach their firing positions undetected, could never assume it would win the war at sea that any wider conflict would have required it to win. That uncertainty was a pillar of deterrence. And deterrence, in the cold arithmetic of the nuclear age, is simply another word for peace. The bombs never fell. The convoys never sailed in anger. The Third Battle of the Atlantic was won precisely because it never had to be fought. And that was no accident. It was the product of relentless, unglamorous, year-upon-year effort by people whose names we will never know. There is a lesson here about how Britain found its place in the world after empire. The country that emerged from the Second World War could not be a superpower. The money was gone. The colonies were going. The old certainties had crumbled, but it could be something else. A nation that punched above its weight through skill rather than size, through expertise rather than mass, through the quiet excellence of its submariners and scientists and intelligence officers. The hunt for Soviet submarines was a model of how a middle-sized power could remain genuinely indispensable to the defense of the West. That model, for better or worse, still shapes British defense policy today. And there is something else, something harder to name. The men who fought this campaign accepted a bargain almost unique in the history of warfare. They risked their lives, spent their careers in the cramped dark, bore the strain of secrecy that no medal could acknowledge, all for a war that, if they did their jobs well enough, would never happen at all. There is a peculiar nobility in that. To prepare with absolute seriousness for a catastrophe in the hope of ensuring it never comes, and then to ask for no credit when it doesn't. It is, perhaps, the purest form of service there is. The hunt continues, in its way, even now. New rivals, new submarines, new tensions in those same cold waters. The GIUK Gap has not gone away, and neither has the patient, listening vigilance that Britain learnt to maintain there over half a century. The boats are different, the names on the maps have changed, but the essential task, to know what moves beneath the waves and to be ready, remains exactly what it was on that foul night in 1974, when a young rating bent over his sonar and held the fate of the realm, for a moment, in his headphones. That, I think, is a story worth remembering. A reminder that the most important battles are sometimes the ones the public never hears about, fought in silence, won in silence, and forgotten in silence. If this is the kind of history you want to see told properly, the hidden campaigns, the secret wars, the British story behind the headlines, then do subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so others can find it too. And I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Do you believe the silent hunt in the Atlantic helped win the Cold War? Or was it an extravagance a bankrupt Britain could never really afford? Tell me in the comments below. I'll be reading everyone.